Okay, welcome to History of Money. Professor Barth here, history professor at Arizona State University. Wow, we are moving right along. Lecture number 27. Today, for part A, we're going to talk about the Greenback controversy. I'm even wearing my green shirt today for the lecture. And we'll hit the Panic of 1873. And then for part B, we're going to introduce a subject that will carry over into lecture 28, the following lecture, and that's this question of bimetallism and the silver question. The silver question will be a big question in American politics toward the end of the 19th century. We're going to introduce it today in part B of the lecture. All right. There is Old Glory, the American flag, right after the Civil War concluded. And we spent some time on the Civil War. For lecture 26, we looked at the national banking system. This is the banking system that will prevail in the United States all the way up through to the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913. However, there's another issue we have not yet touched upon, and that's the greenback currency. What happens to the greenback currency after the war is over? This is a very big policy question after 1865, because as you'll remember, there are hundreds of millions of dollars of fiat greenback paper currency still out there in circulation, even after the war is over. The Union government printed these notes. They're legal tender in public and private payments, meaning that you can use these greenbacks for tax payments. You can also use them to settle a debt payment. So greenbacks are still legal tender after the Civil War is over. What do we do about that? Do we retire them? If we do, is that going to cause deflation? And by ejecting too much money from the system. Meanwhile, the banks have resumed specie payments, so banknotes are redeemable again in gold and silver coin after 1865. So we have a paper currency, but it's redeemable. But then we have this other paper currency that's not redeemable, that's not convertible in gold and silver coin. What do we do about it? That's the big controversy, monetary controversy in the late 1860s into the 1870s. There are still millions and millions of dollars of this fiat paper currency in circulation. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? And they circulate at a discount. Toward the end of the war, it was a discount of about 60%. With the war's conclusion, actually, they've recovered a bit on anticipation that perhaps they'll be redeemed at full value, but they're still operating at a discount of some 15 to 20%. And there are a whole lot of interest groups who would like to see the greenback currency continue and have a vested interest, an economic interest in seeing the greenback currency continue. The greenback has a lot of supporters. First of all, politically, Republicans, by and large, are supporters of the greenback. The Republican Party. The greenback helped the Republican Party win the war, or helped the North win the war, which was controlled and run by the Republican Party. The greenback is a symbol of the Union, a symbol of victory. It's patriotic. It began under Abraham Lincoln. There are lots of reasons why Republicans would really, like this, and it seems to be working okay. It's still at a discount, but it does, provide currency and it's a symbol of national union, of national greatness. But there are some economic interests in favor of the greenback. First of all, railroads. The railroads, by and large, supported the greenback. Why? Well, more currency in circulation makes credit a little easier. Railroads borrow a lot of money. Railroads benefit from a more cheap money policy, you may call it, where there's more money in circulation, even if that money depreciates a little bit. Also, most railroads were heavily indebted to bondholders, and a sort of easy money policy makes it easier to pay debts. If you're a debtor, you're okay with easy money. Railroads are one of the big debtors, and they benefit from this system. Railroads also exercise a lot of influence, corporate influence, within the Republican Party. Another interest, manufacturers and industrialists, especially in iron and steel. The steel industry, why would they support the greenback? Well, a falling dollar helps exports. What do I mean by this? Well, when a currency is depreciating, when currency is getting cheaper, when the value is falling, domestic prices don't increase as rapidly or at the same pace as the price for imported goods purchased from abroad. And so what this does is it discourages Americans from buying imported goods and encourages foreigners to buy cheap American goods. So currency devaluation, currency depreciation can help exports. Industrialists and manufacturers like this because it operated somewhat like a tariff, a sort of tariff protecting American industry. This is why today the Chinese government has a policy and has long had a policy of currency devaluation in order to protect and to encourage Chinese exports and to discourage Chinese imports of foreign goods. And so manufacturers and industrialists support the greenback, and they too make up a big component of the Republican Party. And then lastly, farmers. Farmers more and more in the mid to late 19th century are getting into debt because they have to buy fairly big farming equipment as agricultural technology becomes more sophisticated. And you go into debt, you're going to prefer inflation to deflation. Okay? And many of these interests, the railroads, industrialists, and farmers, fear that an ejection of greenbacks from circulation will lead to deflation, which will hurt U.S. industry, hurt U.S. exports, and hurt anyone who is in debt. Greenback also has a lot of opponents. The party who represents opposition to greenbacks are primarily the Democrats. The Democrats in the 1860s and 1870s still largely support a hard money program. They were also opposed to a national banking system, but in the 1860s they were a minority in Congress and they couldn't stop it. They're a minority in Congress here as well, and so there's nothing the Democrats can do at the moment to retire greenbacks. But that's a Democratic platform. They mostly support a hard money program, and the Democratic Party endorsed a program of what was called specie resumption, meaning they wanted the Treasury to retire the greenbacks and redeem those greenbacks in coin. Redeeming greenbacks in coin and then thus retiring fiat paper currency from the system. Now, the Democrats don't have control of the House, they don't have control of the Senate, and they don't have the White House. But the Democrats have a majority on the Supreme Court. Okay, it's a holdover from the antebellum period. Judges appointed back when the Democrats were still dominating the White House. And in 1870, a case went before the Supreme Court, a lawsuit, where the legal tender status of the greenback was challenged. Hepburn versus Griswold. And the argument made before the court was that the greenback, it's unconstitutional to push a depreciating currency, to force a creditor to take depreciated currency in payment of debts. Democrats had a 5-4 majority on the court, and so the Democrats rule in 1870 that legal tender greenbacks are unconstitutional. This was a huge Supreme Court case at the time and was very, very controversial. The Supreme Court argued that legal tender greenbacks violated the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment states that government cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and by requiring creditors to accept debts in a depreciated currency, the court argued, this was effectually impairing the obligation of contracts and was nullifying contracts. And so based on that Fifth Amendment, they ruled it unconstitutional. The opposing side said, A, this is necessary and proper, and so it falls under a necessary and proper clause. The court said, no, we didn't buy that argument, did not believe that this was a reasonable, necessary, and proper case. And then the opposing side also said, well, Article 1, Section 10, it's true that Article 1, Section 10 says states may not make anything but gold and silver legal tender. That's true, but it doesn't forbid the federal government from making anything but gold and silver legal tender. The court rejected that argument and said that there's nothing in the Constitution to indicate that the federal government has the power of making anything like this fiat paper currency legal tender. Well, as things had it, in 1870, shortly after that decision, there were 2 new vacancies on the Supreme Court. Both of the deceased judges were Democrats. The president at the time is a Republican, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant. Grant appoints 2 Republicans to fill those vacancies. Now, all of a sudden, within a year, Republicans have a 5-4 majority on the court. The case is brought again, pretty much an identical case, to the Supreme Court, Knox v. Lee. And this time in 1871, the court does a complete flip and rules that, legal tender greenbacks are constitutional after all. And the court rejects the Fifth Amendment argument and argues that this currency fell under the necessary and proper clause. They said that the necessity of the Civil War is what gave these notes merit. According to the Supreme Court, the Greenback did, quote, save the government and the Constitution from destruction, end quote. And so this is a constitutional form of currency. And the court under Knox v. Lee ruled that, again, it's true, Article 1, Section 10 says states may not make anything but gold and silver legal tender, but it doesn't speak to the federal government. And so the federal government has a constitutional right to make greenbacks legal tender in the United States. Knox v. Lee. And to this day, right, public and private payments, you don't need gold and silver, right? That's not seen as any longer a constitutional obligation. That argument dates to this decision of Knox v. Lee. Well, so the greenback seems to have been saved. It's still controversial. Meanwhile, between the end of the Civil War and the early 1870s, a bubble began to pick up again. Man, it seems like financial history is just one bubble after another. A new bubble. This time, it was in railroads, a big railroad bubble. Now, we saw this stat last time in Lecture 26, but look at the growth in national banks. Look at all that new money in circulation, plus millions of dollars in greenbacks, which are still in circulation. So between the greenbacks and all of these national bank notes and national bank deposits based on fractional reserves, an asset bubble builds behind the railroad companies. This is a cartoon from 1870, The Great Race for the Western Stakes, and this is Cornelius Vanderbilt competing against James Fisk. All these different railroad companies duking it out. The Northern Pacific Railroad going from Minnesota to Washington State. Epic line, extremely expensive, relied on heavy credit. Bond sales, this is stock, a share in the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. Well, Northern Pacific Railroad Company in 1873, which was owned, by the way, by the House of Cook, Jay Cook, remember Jay Cook, went bankrupt. And this set off a panic, and before you know it, financial panic sweeps the nation. The bubble burst. A bunch of railroad companies either went under or just faced crippling debt. Things bounced back pretty quickly. Like, it wasn't like a long-lasting depression, but afterwards, for the next several years, the economy was kind of on a shaky ground and things were a bit stagnant. And so, pretty severe crash, and then a recovery upward, but followed by just kind of a malaise in the economy through the rest of the 1870s. The 1870s were not the most prosperous decade in the 19th century U.S. Well, the railroads, in response to 1873, said, we need more greenbacks. Not only should we not retire the greenbacks, the railroad said, we need to issue more greenbacks. And so there were interests trying to convince the Republican Party to emit more greenbacks. However, there was an election that year, in 1874, not a presidential election, but a congressional election. And in 1874, the public reacted against the Republican Party, blamed the Republican Party, essentially, for the panic, blamed the railroads, and bought into the argument that the Democrats were making of, hey, all these greenbacks in circulation, our financial system's a bit of a mess, we need to calm down, let's retire the greenbacks. That's what the Democrats campaigned on, and in 1874, they swept the election, and for the first time since the 1850s, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. And again, they campaigned on specie resumption. Retiring the greenbacks was what the Democrats campaigned on. And sure enough, in January 1875, Congress passed a law called the Resumption Act. The Resumption Act. Resumption Act of 1875. And this act stipulated that in 4 years, the Treasury will retire all the greenbacks from circulation and redeem them at face value for gold. All right? So here's a gold coin from 1878. 1878, gold coin. There's a greenback. 4 years. Now, why 4 years? Well, why not just do it, in a few months? Well, the Treasury had to purchase the gold. That's a lot of gold that's going to have to be used to purchase or to redeem these greenbacks. And so over the next 4 years, the Treasury sold U.S. bonds, primarily in Europe, for gold and collected all the gold that it needed. And the intention was, with this gold bought in Europe, by the sale of U.S. bonds, so increasing the national debt. The national debt went up because of this. Selling the U.S. bonds for gold, collecting that gold for specie resumption in 1879. Well, so that's the plan. Congress passes this bill in January of 1875. There was immense pressure on President Grant, a Republican, remember, President Grant, to veto this legislation. The railroads, the steel industrialists, all these different manufacturing groups were urging Grant to veto the law. He has that power. Grant ended up signing the bill into law, made a lot of enemies because of it. Here's a cartoon, all the industrialists and railroad executives furious with Grant for signing this into law. It's going to take 4 years to take effect. And so, during that 4-year period, momentum began to build around, repealing this law before it goes into the effect. And actually, a third party emerged called the Greenback Party. And it won some national support. In 1876, they ran a presidential candidate, Peter Cooper. Look at what a guy over here on the left. He was the first nominee for the party. Got only 1% of the national vote, but in 1880, they ran a gentleman named James Weaver. Ended up getting 3% of the national vote. Ran another candidate in 1884, only got 1%, and then it disappeared. But for a brief period, he had this new third party called the Greenback Party. Actually, the 1880s was a booming decade. Actually, the 1880s might be the most phenomenal decade of economic and industrial expansion in the 19th century, if not the entire history of the United States. Very, very, very productive decade. Wealth per capita in 1880s rose about 4% per annum. Gross national product rose every year. Wages, real wages, increased all across the board. In the 1880s, there was a 40% increase in the number of business establishments. Very, very prosperous decade. After, through most of the 1870s, only barely increasing, mostly stagnation in the 1870s. That being said, prices did fall. There was deflation, some deflation in the 1880s. Actually, the money supply itself increased by about 6% because you had all these national banknotes in circulation. The money supply went up, but prices went down, mostly because of increased productivity. Goods became cheaper as productivity and production increased, offsetting the increase in the money supply. So there was a general fall in prices. Nevertheless, real wages increased, and so the Greenback agitation disappeared. Greenback agitation disappeared. All right, next time for Part B, we're going to look at another issue, a third and final issue for the 19th century. And then when we're done with that, we'll move on to the 20th century. But bimetallism becomes a major, major, major political issue toward the end of the 19th century. We're going to introduce that subject for Part B. See you there.